Now the story of the Jewish exiles who lost everything, and the one man who had no choice but to help them rebuild it. It's the book of Nehemiah. Imagine this. The year is 2035. We're coming off of an era of great tumult and conflict and tension, but finally the conflict is over. And almost spontaneously, it seems, a whole bunch of the people who've been involved in the conflict overseas, they all come home. They land in New York, and they get in vehicles and on foot and dressed in their fatigues and in their white sailor outfits. They start walking through lower Manhattan. And almost spontaneously, a whole bunch of people who are unified at the idea of the victory they have earned and eager to celebrate this momentous event, they start ripping up paper in their apartments all up and down, all clear up to the top of these buildings. Then as the soldiers and sailors walk down below and people gather to cheer and wave flags and celebrate, the people upstairs, they start dumping all of this shredded up paper out of the windows, and it twists and twirls down, creating almost a snowstorm effect, but it's the middle of summer, and the celebration and the jubilance is out of control. People are elated and celebrating the old barriers that cause people to not like each other. It's all gone. Everybody's unified in one voice, in one accord. Where does your brain go? Obviously, if this were to happen in 2035, your brain goes right to the celebration at the end of World War II. It goes back to a previous triumphant moment where all of these things happened. And if such an event were to occur in 2035, or pick any random date in the future, people are going to make of such an event one of two things. It is either going to be regarded as, one, a limp attempt to cruise on the laurels or the reputation of something awesome that happened before in a failed effort to make the new thing seem like it is comparable to the old thing that everybody agrees really was great. Or it really does rise to that level and everybody's going to be like, no, this is totally appropriate. All of these visuals, all of this pomp and celebration, all of the vibe that we're conjuring here, all of these optics, they are totally appropriate because this hypothetical victory or celebration that could happen someday in the future is reminiscent of the level of triumph and celebration and awesomeness that happened at the end of World War II. There are certain spectacles in a cultural memory. There are certain assemblies and mass uprisings of joy or demonstration that are sea change moments or seminal moments in the history of a culture. And I think we're getting one of those in Nehemiah chapter 8 on September the 27th, 444 BC, a day that would change the course of the world. A day in a set of circumstances where if there was photography back then, there'd probably be an iconic image attached to this one too, like that of the sailor dipping the secretary girl in New York who we'd never even met and just smooching her. There are people who actually complain about that now. Come on, can we not have anything fun and awesome? There would be some kind of image like that that would resonate across the ages because this assembly is a gigantic deal in the history of the Old Testament, but it's not new. This assembly would have conjured cultural memory for everybody who was familiar with the story of 4 previous gigantic assemblies where the descendants of Abraham, in years past, even centuries past, had gathered together to declare with one voice, we are going to do this thing. We are going to be a part of God's redemptive plan. We are going to do the stuff that God would have us do because we are a unique people, set apart, a nation of priests. And this stuff we're reading about in Nehemiah chapter 8, Act 3 of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah is another one of these such events that would have called to mind other such events in the past. Here's where we're getting Nehemiah basically 8:1. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, all the people assembled as one man in the square before the water gate. They told Ezra the scribe to bring out the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded for Israel. And this unified public assembly on the back end of building something and becoming aware once again of who they are and what their purpose is and what they're doing would echo first and foremost, most recently, the events of Ezra chapter 3, where in verse 1 it says, "When the 7th month came and the Israelites settled in their towns, the people assembled as one man in Jerusalem. Then Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and his fellow priests," turning the page, "and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates began to build the altar of the God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices. Then, in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. After that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, and the sacrifice for all the appointed sacred feasts of the Lord, as well as those brought out as free will offerings to the Lord. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid." Now, that celebration would have occurred in 536 BC, about 90 years before the stuff that we're looking at here in the book of Nehemiah. So nobody's still going to be alive who would remember that, but it happened at basically the exact same time of year. So I don't know if in Israel in the 5th century BC, there was a crisp in the air that would tell you, oh, it's, fall football season like we feel where I live. But there would have been some seasonal marker, some sort of feel, some sort of seasonal thing that would have alerted people to, oh, it's time for this particular celebration. It's what we now call September. And that bit of cultural memory would have been handed on over the course of 90 years. So there would have been a seasonal rhythm that would have felt the same between this assembly and the last great, seemingly spontaneous assembly. But also they're celebrating similar things. They're getting back on their feet. There are great and reliable leaders among them who are giving them direction, and the people are becoming more familiar. They're refamiliarizing themselves with who they are and the role that they play in the world. And the season in which both of these great assemblies, the first in the book of Ezra in 536 BC, and the second that we're looking at now in Nehemiah in 444 BC, the season should not be overlooked here because it's attached to the Feast of Tabernacles. And during this time, people went out and lived in little booths, little huts, tents. They made little shed town USAs that they would set up shop in. And the idea was to remind them of what it was like to be out in the desert, in the wandering, and how God provided for them while they were out there. Well, there's a narrative connection there, because remember, this whole era of exile, it starts off with the prophet Jeremiah famously relaying to the people from God before the temple's even been knocked over by Nebuchadnezzar yet. But Jeremiah is saying, hey, that's coming. You're going to get taken into captivity. It's going to be a tough time. But don't worry, says the Lord, I have plans to prosper you and not to harm you. God is saying, I haven't forgotten my people, and there's going to be this restoration that is coming. In the meantime, live well in these places. Do things that are for the benefit of the city, and then eventually there's going to be a return. So in a way, this whole exile period that starts in 586 BC with Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem, and that runs up past the age of Cyrus into the age of the Persians through the late 500s and through the 400s, all of this echoes the Egypt stuff from clear back in Exodus. All of this is sort of like a repetition, a reset, maybe you could even call it a soft reboot of the origin story of the Jewish people, with Moses, a great leader who rises up, and there's this exodus, this return to a promised land, and God provides for them during these very delicate, difficult times in between these times of transition. But then there's a reestablishment in the land, and in the midst of all of that stuff, God reveals his law, and the people align themselves to that law. Well, the Feast of Tabernacles is meant to be a reminder of all of that. And here we are looking at the first of the two assemblies we're going to look at here over the course of a couple days. And the one in Ezra 3 falls right in the middle of Feast of Tabernacles season. And the one here in Nehemiah 8 falls right in the middle of Feast of Tabernacles season. And in this way, it would seem that the text is suggesting that God is providentially using the rhythms of the season, the religious rhythms of the season, to remind the people of how this story connects to the grand story of their past and to orient them properly to what is next. And what is next is a reorientation to the law, a reconnection to the law, a resubmission to the law. And of course, the law is demonstrative of the authority and the character of God. So in the same way that if you see another giant ticker tape parade with soldiers and sailors in downtown New York City where everybody's unified in the future in your lifetime, your brain is going to go right back to the images that you recall from World War II, whether you were alive for that or not. So here in Nehemiah chapter 8 on September 27th, 444 BC, this giant assembly gathers together by the water gate in recently rebuilt Jerusalem, and they're saying, "Bring out the book of the law of Moses." And in doing so, they were conjuring the imagery and the cultural memory of the assembly that happened back in 536 BC that's recorded in the book of Ezra, and in the assemblies that happened in centuries past that we're going to look at tomorrow. And thematically, every such assembly like this in the Old Testament is a grand act of unified submission to God and reorientation of the people to God's law and God's character and to serving and following Him. It looks like some really interesting things are cooking here. More on all of that tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.